217 kilometers from shore, no boat in sight, no life jacket, just a single German shepherd swimming for his life. When a fisherman spotted something bobbing in the middle of the ocean, he thought it was driftwood, but as he got closer, his heart nearly stopped. A dog, exhausted, soaked, and fighting to stay above water, was alone in the vast, merciless sea. No one could explain how he got there, but what happened next defied every expectation and will leave you speechless. The sea was calm, deceptively calm, the kind of stillness that made seasoned fishermen uneasy, the kind that always came before a storm miles off the coast of Florida. 42-year-old Thomas Grady guided his modest fishing vessel through open waters he had set out before sunrise, hoping for tuna. But 6 hours in all he'd caught was sunburn and silence. Then he saw it. At first he assumed it was driftwood, just another piece of wreckage carried by the current. But something about the way it moved, how it fought the tide instead of drifting with it, pulled at his gut. He grabbed his binoculars and focused. That's when his heart skipped. It was a dog, a German shepherd, clearly exhausted, barely keeping his head above water. Alone, no land in sight, no boat nearby. Nothing. Thomas's stomach tightened. This wasn't just rare. It was impossible. How the hell? He muttered, already throttling the boat in the animal's direction. As he approached, the reality became more harrowing. The dog's legs were still paddling, but slow, erratic. His head bobbed with every wave, mouth barely above the surface. He had minutes left, maybe less. Thomas cut the engine and shouted over the side, "Hey, hang in there, buddy, I've got you." The dog didn't respond. He was too far gone to react. His eyes glazed with a mix of terror and exhaustion. Without hesitation, Thomas yanked off his shirt, tossed a rope ladder overboard, and dove in. The water was colder than expected. Salt stung his eyes, but he powered through the swells, keeping his eyes locked on the shepherd's weakening strokes. When he finally reached him, the dog's legs gave out. His body collapsed into Thomas's arms like dead weight. Thomas held him up with one arm and kicked furiously with the other, dragging the shepherd back toward the boat. Once they reached the ladder, Thomas pushed from beneath, while the dog instinctively clawed his way up, collapsing onto the deck in a trembling heap. Thomas followed, panting hard. He knelt beside the animal, gently brushing water from his face. The dog's chest was rising, barely. His fur was sulked and tangled. His paws were raw. His breathing was shallow but steady. "You're alive," Thomas whispered. "You crazy, beautiful beast, you're alive." He wrapped the dog in a dry tarp and grabbed a bottle of fresh water. The shepherd didn't move. Thomas sat beside him, heart pounding, drenched and shaking. Not from the cold, but from the sheer impossibility of what he just witnessed. He looked around at the endless blue stretching in every direction. "What were you doing out here, boy?" he asked quietly. The dog didn't answer, but deep in those amber eyes something flickered. Not fear, not pain, but something else, a silent, unbreakable will to survive. Thomas draped the soaked tarp tighter around the German shepherd and steered the boat toward the nearest marina. Nearly 2 hours away, the sun had shifted, casting a golden sheen across the waves. But the dog didn't lift his head. He just lay there shivering. Every few minutes, Thomas glanced over, still breathing, still alive. But the questions wouldn't stop. No collar, no harness, no life vest, no tracker, nothing. The only thing the shepherd had was raw skin under his front legs, like he'd been swimming for hours, maybe longer. Thomas had seen dogs thrown from boats before, cruel owners discarding them like trash, but not this far out. 217 kilometers from shore. That was something else entirely. He reached out carefully, placing a hand on the dog's back. "You got a name, boy?" No response, not even a twitch. Thomas studied the dog's face. His eyes were open now, faintly alert, not trusting. Not yet, but watching when the vape reached land. Thomas didn't go straight to animal control. Something inside him resisted that. Instead, he carried the dog, weak and limp, into his truck and drove straight to a small vet clinic he knew just outside of Clearwater. The receptionist looked up as he pushed through the door. "Sir, you can't just—" "He almost drowned 135 miles out," Thomas interrupted. "No ID, no explanation. I just need someone to look at him." That silenced the room. A young vet appeared, eyes wide. "You said 135 miles offshore?" Thomas nodded. I found him swimming alone. Within seconds. The dog was taken to the back room. Thomas sat in the waiting area dripping seawater and worry. He didn't even know why he felt so attached already. Maybe it was the way the shepherd hadn't given up. Not even when everything in the world said he should have. The vet came out 20 minutes later. He severely dehydrated, scraped up, exhausted beyond belief. But she paused almost in disbelief. His heart strong, somehow he made it. Thomas exhaled in relief. Thank God, no chip, the vet added. But we did find something odd. She handed Thomas a small rusted piece of metal. It was tangled in his fur near his neck. It looks like part of a broken dog tag. Thomas turned it over. Most of the engraving was gone, but a single letter remained. R, no number, no name, just R that night. Thomas took the dog home. His own place was modest, a one-bedroom cabin near the water, with peeling paint and an old dock out back. He laid the dog on a folded blanket and set a bowl of water nearby. The shepherd still wouldn't eat, but his eyes followed Thomas with quiet focus before bed. Thomas sat cross-legged near him and whispered, "You made it out of something no dog should have survived. I don't know how or why, but I promise I'm not letting you go." The dog blinked slowly. Not trust, not yet, but something was there. Something growing. The next morning, Thomas woke up to the sound of claws tapping softly against the wooden floor. For a second he thought it was a dream, but when he opened his eyes he saw the German shepherd, weak but standing. Walking slowly around the cabin, he moved stiffly, favoring one leg, but he was moving. Thomas sat up. "Hey, look at you." The dog didn't wag his tail. He didn't respond to the voice with joy like most dogs, but he paused, looked at Thomas, and blinked once. Thomas stood and poured a fresh bowl of water and set out some cooked chicken. The shepherd sniffed it, then began to eat, slow and cautious, but steady. It was the first time he'd eaten since the rescue. Thomas crouched nearby, watching closely. "You're not just smart," he muttered. "You're trained, I can feel it." There was a calm to the dog's movements, something intentional. He didn't flinch at a sudden noise. He didn't beg for food. He didn't bark or whimper. He simply observed, calculated, like a soldier surveying a new battlefield. Thomas, a former Navy rescue diver, had seen that behavior before in working dogs after breakfast. Thomas stepped onto his dock. The salty wind swept in from the sea. Stirring memories, he heard the soft steps behind him. The shepherd had followed. He stood beside Thomas, looking out across the water, where he had nearly died. "You've seen things," Thomas said without looking at him. "Haven't you?" The dog didn't move later that day. Thomas made a call to a friend, a retired K-9 handler named Mike, who now worked at a private training center. "I need you to meet someone." Thomas said something's off, or maybe exactly right. "But I think this dog was trained." Mike arrived that afternoon, a tall man with sharp eyes. He entered the cabin and crouched without speaking. The shepherd stood still, ears slightly raised but not aggressive. Mike watched him closely. "Sit," he said calmly. The dog didn't move, lie down, no response. But then Mike did something subtle. He extended two fingers, palm down, then lowered them in a slight curve. The dog instantly dropped to the floor, tail tucked slightly, his eyes locked on. Mike Thomas's eyes widened. "What was that?" "Silent signal," Mike replied, "used in tactical ops. Whoever trained him for something big." Mike stood and looked at Thomas. "You didn't just rescue a stray. You pulled a working dog out of the ocean." Thomas glanced down at the shepherd, now lying still watching. Why would a trained dog be 135 miles offshore? He asked. Mike didn't answer. He didn't need to, because the next question was worse: who sent him there and why? That night Thomas couldn't sleep. He sat by the window staring at the dog, now resting at the foot of his bed. That piece of metal, the broken tag with a R, sat on the table. He picked it up, turned it over again. No chip, no ID, no answers. But now there was something more. A mission, a trail, and the terrifying possibility that this dog had seen something or escaped something. No one was supposed to know as Thomas reached down to run his hand over the shepherd's back. The dog leaned slightly into the touch. For the first time his tail moved just a little. Not trust, but the beginning of it. 2 days passed. The shepherd, now responding to the nickname Ranger, had begun to regain strength. He followed Thomas through the cabin, rested near his feet, and even nudged his hand for more chicken when he thought no one was watching. But what disturbed Thomas most was how Ranger reacted to certain sounds. Not thunderstorms, not fireworks, but helicopters. Every time a chopper passed overhead, even faint and far, Ranger froze, his ears dropped. His body crouched low, and his eyes, those alert, intelligent eyes, turned hard and sharp, trained. Traumatized, Thomas couldn't shake it. He picked up the broken tag again, the metal piece they had pulled from Reers's fur, and stared at the faded ear. There had to be more a story. A place, something dogs didn't just appear in the middle of the ocean. So he did what he hadn't done in years. He opened the old laptop in his closet, the one he hadn't used since retiring, and reconnected with a secured search database only military and ex-contractors had access to. It was risky, but the mystery had gnawed at him for days. He typed in a few key filters: German Shepherd, military K9, no chips, last tactical signals, last known East Coast operations. What popped up wasn't a public report, it was a restricted file. Red flagged operation, Nightmark Animal Asset Recovery Program. Thomas blinked, he'd never heard of it. He clicked access, denied. He dug deeper, using a few legacy override codes from his diving ops. He finally got partial access. The screen loaded: black background, white text, asset R, 7 breed, German Shepherd, sex male assignment, offshore reconnaissance handler, classified status. Decommissioned, presumed lost at sea, date of deactivation 3 days before Thomas found him. Thomas leaned back in his chair, stunned. They knew Ranger was out there, and they'd marked him lost, not rescued. The file had no details on who trained him or why he was deployed offshore. But it was clear Ranger had been part of something covert, something buried, and someone didn't want him found. Thomas heard movement behind him. He turned. Ranger stood in the hallway, eyes locked on the laptop screen, ears raised. "You recognize this, don't you?" Thomas whispered. The dog stayed still. Then Thomas heard it, the unmistakable rumble of tires on gravel. He stepped to the window and pulled back the curtain. A black SUV had pulled up to the edge of his driveway. No plates, 2 men in plain clothes stepped out. One carried a small device, the other wore gloves. Ranger began to growl, low, almost silent. Thomas closed the laptop and backed away. Someone had been watching the database, and now they were here. "Come on, Ranger," he whispered, grabbing his keys. They slipped out the back door, quietly disappearing into the woods behind the cabin. Thomas's old truck was parked down the trail just in case Ranger moved beside him, silent as a shadow, fully alert once they were inside the truck. Thomas looked down at the shepherd. "Whatever they were doing with you, they're not done." Ranger didn't blink. He was ready. Thomas drove with one eye on the road and the other on the rearview mirror. The SUV hadn't followed, at least not visibly, but that didn't mean they weren't being tracked. Ranger sat in the passenger seat, alert and tense, his ears swiveling at every sound. His body language wasn't panic, it was calculation. He was processing the situation, just like Thomas was like a soldier. They left the paved road behind and followed an old dirt trail that led to a remote marina Thomas had used in his diving days. It was barely maintained now, just a few forgotten docks and one rusty storage shed. But that was the point. He pulled the truck into the shadows and killed the engine. "We'll stay here tonight," he said softly. Ranger didn't move, but his breathing had slowed. He was conserving energy, waiting inside the shed. Thomas laid out blankets and closed the creaky door behind them. The air smelled like salt and old oil. Ranger sniffed every corner before settling in near the entrance, guarding always. Guarding, Thomas sat beside him and finally let out the question that had haunted him since the file appeared. "What were they using you for?" Boy, he didn't expect an answer, but he kept talking. "I've seen dogs like you, military trackers, detection, K9s, even deep-sea deployment teams. But you're different. You weren't just trained to obey, you were trained to think." Ranger looked up at him. His eyes weren't blank. They were present, deep, and aware. And then he did something Thomas didn't expect. He gently rested his paw on Thomas's boot. A small gesture, but full of meaning. Thomas swallowed hard. "You trust me now?" A soft exhale, not quite a sigh, but close. That night they both slept lightly, ears and senses alert at sunrise. Thomas took Ranger down to the dock. He had one last plan, and it was dangerous. "I'm going to find out who deployed you," he said, tightening the straps on a dry bag. But they'll be looking for you now, so you'll need to stay hidden. He hesitated. Unless you want out. Ranger tilted his head. You've been through enough. I wouldn't blame you if he disappeared into the forest and never looked back. But Ranger stepped forward and placed his body between Thomas and the edge of the dock, blocking him. No, Ranger looked straight into his eyes, no words needed. Thomas smiled faintly. All right, partner. They loaded onto a small boat stashed behind the pier. Thomas had used it for dives years ago, fast, silent, and barely legal. It was old but reliable. As the boat pulled away, Thomas scanned the shoreline, and there, half hidden by trees, was the black SUV. He cursed under his breath. They had tracked. The truck ranger stood at the front of the boat, wind pushing through his fur, eyes sharp and locked on the shore. Then the SUV's passenger door opened. A figure stepped out, dressed in black face, hidden by a cap and glasses. He raised the phone, spoke into it suddenly. Ranger let out a bark, not of fear, but recognition. Thomas looked at him. You know him. Ranger barked again, this time louder, then turned in a tight circle on the deck. Agitated, is he your handler? No answer, just focused pacing. Thomas turned to the boat, hard toward the open water. We're not ready for that, he muttered. Not yet. Ranger sat down but never looked away from the vanishing figure. Whoever that man was, friend or enemy. One thing was now certain, Ranger remembered, and soon so would the world. The ocean was rougher than expected. Thomas tightened his grip on the wheel as the small boat pitched over a wave. The engine groaning under the strain. Ranger stood beside him. Pause, steady gaze, locked on the horizon. Neither of them had spoken for nearly an hour. But the weight between them was heavy. Ranger was no longer just a mystery. He was a piece of something bigger, something dangerous. Thomas pulled into a hidden cove he used during his diving years. Jagged cliffs surrounded it, and it was only accessible by water or by foot through miles of overgrown brush, perfect for hiding. He killed the engine and let the silence settle. All right, he muttered, tossing a rope to the rocky shore. Time for answers. He opened the dry bag and pulled out the printed version of the restricted file asset R7. Thomas sat on the boat's bench and read it again. There were no names, no locations, just tactical terms, a coded mission summary, and a chilling final entry: terminated due to compromise. Terminated. They had meant to kill him, and yet Ranger had survived, not by accident, by will, by instinct. By refusing to drown, Thomas reached into the bag again and pulled out the broken tag they had found tangled in Raris's fur. It was still crusted with salt, the R barely visible. Ranger, Thomas whispered, is that what they called you, or is that what you became? The dog looked at him, not blankly, not as a pet would, but as something more, as a partner. Suddenly, Ranger stood and walked to the bow. His ears went up, not in fear, but in awareness. Thomas followed his gaze far off a helicopter. Black, silent, fast. How did they find us again? Ranger let out a low whine, then jumped off the boat and onto the rocks. He ran toward a crevice in the cliff, where a narrow path wound upward. Without thinking, Thomas followed. At the top of the trail, they crouched behind a boulder. The helicopter hovered for a moment, then descended several hundred meters away. Doors opened, 4 figures in black gear. Emerged, helmets, visors, no insignia. But the 5th figure stood out. No mask, no helmet. Just a weathered face and a calm stance. Ranger froze. Thomas looked down at him. You know him, don't you? The shepherd's tail lowered, his eyes locked on the man. I think I found your handler. The man scanned the area, then pulled something from his pocket, a small device. He pressed a button. A high-pitched pulse, almost too soft for human ears, vibrated in the air. Ranger flinched. He stumbled backward, whimpering. Hey, what's happening? Thomas grabbed his fur, trying to steady him. Ranger shook his head, paw at his ears. Pain, confusion. Thomas turned back to the man and the device. They're trying to override you. The handler raised his hand, pointing directly at the cliff. No words, just a signal. Seconds later, 2 armed figures started up the path. Thomas grabbed Ranger by the harness. We're leaving now. But Ranger didn't move. He looked up at Thomas, torn. Something inside him was still responding to the signal. Old commands, old bonds. I know it hurts. Thomas said, voice tight. But you get to choose who you are now, not them. The sound intensified. Ranger whimpered again, trembling violently, and then he barked a single, sharp bark that echoed off the cliffs. He turned, lunged forward, and began to run, not down the trail but toward the helicopter. "Wait, Ranger!" Thomas shouted, but he understood Ranger wasn't running back to them. He was running to end it. Thomas followed, adrenaline flooding his system. He kept his distance. Heart pounding, Ranger reached the clearing just as the two-armed men turned to intercept. He didn't hesitate. He lunged straight into one man's leg, knocking him sideways. The second reached for a weapon, but Thomas tackled him from behind. Adrenaline surging, the weapon clattered to the ground. One man down, the other disarmed. The handler stepped forward, finally speaking. "Stand down, R7. Ranger froze. The voice was familiar. It pulled at something buried deep inside him. "Return mission isn't over." Thomas stepped between them. "It is now." The handler looked him over. "You think you can protect him? He's not just a dog, he's a classified tool, one with loose ends." Thomas raised his voice. "He's not a tool, he's a survivor, and he made his choice." Ranger beside Thomas stared at his former handler and growled. It wasn't rage, it was closure. The helicopter engine with one of the armed men shouted something unintelligible, and the group began retreating. The handler lingered for a moment, longer. Eyes locked with Thomas. "You're making a mistake," he said. Thomas nodded. "Maybe, but it's ours, the helicopter. For next part, stay connected.